I think one of the helpful things to understand is there are differences between complex trauma and between post-traumatic stress disorder. So with the complex post-traumatic stress disorder, it is based in relationships and defective relationships and harmful relationships. And post-traumatic stress disorder is grounded typically in an event that has a start and an end time that is identifiable. So in this next part, we'll talk about those differences.
So of course, there's always political and historical factors to consider. So when we're looking at trauma, it really pretty much started around the time we're looking at soldiers in World War I. The term shell shock, some of you may be familiar with, some of us that are older definitely are familiar with. It was really detrimental to the war effort. So the medical community was pretty much forbidden to talk about, address, or deal with shell shock. But by the time World War II came around, Abram Gardner, he started writing, and he wanted to write about what he was seeing with the neurosis of war. And he started to prepare physicians what they would be dealing with in post-war care when all these soldiers started coming back. He also referred to a physioneurosis. The body is going to continue to behave and react like it did when it was going through the stress. And I know I can relate to that because I can go into a fear response. I'm immediately transported right back to what happened. So my body goes back there even though I'm here. And I know cognitively I'm safe, but my body's telling me otherwise. So then we fast forward about 40 years, and now we're starting to look at the term post-traumatic stress disorder. So in 1980, the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, added this diagnosis to the DSM. The DSM stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. That's like the book that therapists and insurance companies use to pretty much qualify you for treatments if you're in the North American system. And what started happening when we're looking at history, politics, and science, they started noticing for every one veteran that was coming in, about 30 children just in our homes were presenting with a lot of stress responses. So there's this other, how science, sometimes these random things happen, and that's where our best research comes from. So in 1980, there's a weight loss study of severely obese. And there was a history of these patients dropping out, even though they were having success and they were actually able to lose the weight, they were dropping out. So the physician got really curious and started visiting with these people and asking questions. And he misread one of his standardized questions. And the question was, how much did you weigh at your first sexual encounter? And one of the first respondents said 40 pounds. So this really stunned them because then that meant this person was a child. This was a small individual when this happened. So he started asking other dropouts from the study, and he was shocked to find almost every single one of them had been sexually abused as children. Their first sexual encounter was when they were of a very small weight, which literally translated in further questioning into them being children. So weight is then viewed as a coping mechanism. And I think this did an awful lot of good for many of us because it's not a character default. It is truly a coping mechanism. So now we're going to move forward to the 1990s. This study was done called ACEs. So ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, and this came out of the study on weight because the weight study was done by Kaiser Permanente. Kaiser Permanente is a huge medical group and organization down in the United States. They did the study in cooperation with the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. And for a couple of years, they went and started asking all kinds of questions about positive and negative childhood experiences. They really wanted to figure out what those experiences did in childhood, how they impacted future violence, victimization, and as well as perpetration on long-term health outcomes. So it was a very complex and interesting study. What's happened is this ACEs study has demonstrated that repeated childhood experiences that were adverse can actually change behavioral and brain mechanisms and our coping. Our physiology truly changes. So that has a lot of impact on how we're informed and how we need to treat ourselves. So the types of events that can lead to symptoms when you're looking at complex PTSD, the trauma is long-term exposure. It's over a long period of time, and it's typically at the hands and the context of a relationship. So a parent, a caregiver, someone that you're in touch with over a long period of time. And as you have these ongoing insults, whether they're physical, sexual, emotional, the insult can be by omission, meaning it's happening to you, or by omission, neglect. It disrupts your sense of self. And this is such a key time period, usually from birth to 6, 7, 8 years old, when you're literally developing your sense of self and you're counting on the adults around you to teach you how to regulate what it means to be yourself versus the other person in the room. And then we have no social support or very little social support. And because our survival needs are not being met, whether it is being nurtured, being fed, being protected, it causes us to have a neurological rewiring in our brain. So we start developing these truly healthy coping mechanisms early on, but they become very maladaptive as we get older. So if we look at how that complex trauma is different from what they're now calling simple PTSD, I don't like that term so much, but that's what we're using. So it's a single incident typically. There's a start date, there's an end date, or start time and end time. It could be like a car accident, a natural disaster, some violent act that happens in front of you, sexual assault. These are the kinds of things that are going to be post-traumatic stress disorder. So there's a lot of commonality in what happens to the human being in such a stressful situation. However, the long-term exposures really make it more complex to deal with unwinding and healing from CPTSD. So let's look at now, we're in 2018. So we flash forward from World War I. In 2018, our reality, that Diagnostic Statistic manual still does not include a diagnosis of complex PTSD. Now, mind you, back in 1980, PTSD was finally introduced. So I think the way this can harm us is therapists need to be paid by insurance companies. Insurance companies want to, streamline and deal with our treatments in a little box. It's prescribed, and that's what you get. That's what this is about. Complex trauma, it's the biggest disservice you could do to someone with complex trauma. And it also leads to misdiagnosis. So that's a highlight of that. I could go into a whole nother couple of hours talking about issues related to that. Also, in our present day, our medical systems are truly not meeting our needs. And what I mean by that is trauma is a specialty. A therapist who has gone through their basic training, just like a regular physician, a general practitioner, they simply may not know how to help a person who's dealing with trauma or understand the nuances of the varieties of types of trauma, leading to more misdiagnosis, leading to treatments that may re-traumatize and shame someone who is already feeling out of control because no one believes them, no one will help them, and they can get no relief. So our treatment challenges, things like EMDR, the rapid eye movement treatments, they have a really high efficacy rate for post-traumatic stress disorder. Not as much so with complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So I think there really are key differences in treatments. Each individual is going to need a different type of treatment at a different point in time. Something that works for someone with complex trauma today may not work in 30 minutes or tomorrow or in a week. They may need some other coping mechanisms to help unwrap the wiring that's going on and rewire new synapses. And so any treating therapist really needs to be aware of this and work within our own window of tolerance. The other thing that I think is incredibly important, we have to be really gentle with our expectations and try different approaches. And if they don't work, that doesn't mean we're not broken. It just means it's not a good fit for us in this moment of time. It's truly complex. So here's my WTF take on it all. When we're getting into the medical system attempting to address complex trauma, the traditional models and limitations really end up causing further trauma because we have no control. That's exactly what caused in our original relationships, we had no control. We're at the mercy of the gatekeepers. They can tell us how many treatments we qualify for. They can tell us all kinds of things. Again, it's exactly what happens when you're in a traumatic, long-term situation. You have gatekeepers that tell you what to think, what to do, when to do it, stay in the lines, no, you can't, you get the idea. And so our maladaptive behaviors really are not viewed as survival or coping mechanisms. They're viewed as character flaws and defects. And this is where, many of us go off the charts because we're no longer validated, even though we know something really isn't right. So again, complex PTSD really was a healthy response to an unhealthy situation.
So my hope in sharing this information is that you can start to understand some of the nuances and differences that can impact the type of treatment that you might want to seek out, or might even want to challenge yourself to understand why this prescribed treatment is not working for you. There are definitely, literally, more complex neurological, physiological things happening to someone who is trying to process and recover from complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And I don't want to get into sort of a comparison match or which is worse or which is better. I've had both. They both have really different challenges and different presentations for myself, and that doesn't mean it would be the same for you. We're all individuals. We all have our own internal systems, our own physical bodies, our own perceptions, our own filters, and all of these nuances of self help and challenge us in our recovery. They can help us find clues about what we need next. And that's where I really want to encourage you to be really comfortable in becoming the expert on yourself. It's great to have our experts around us to help us navigate, but ultimately we are the experts on our process, on our unwinding, on our rewiring, and ultimately that regaining of autonomy for ourselves. We have to have the patience, the kindness, and the love for self to re-embrace all these lost parts